Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Manchester Art Gallery for our celebration of public transport policy. This is Bus Regulation, the musical. Hold on to your seats. Over the next 30 minutes, you'll be taken on a whistle-stop tour of more than 50 years of history. We'll see how key political decisions have affected the quality of our public transport network and how the quality of our public transport network ultimately affects the quality of our lives. Please welcome your host for this afternoon, Dame Barbara Castle.
Hello everybody, hello. Thank you so much for coming today. For anyone who doesn't know me, I am indeed Dame Barbara Castle. I was elected to Parliament as MP for Blackburn in 1945. Yes, I was then the youngest female MP. I served in Clement Attlee's Labour government and then in opposition in the 1950s, until we won power again in 1964. And then, in 1965, I became Transport Secretary, the only woman in the 20th century to have held that position. And that is, of course, why I am here today. My predecessors made some terrible mistakes and decisions in the previous decades. All of our trams had been ripped up and destroyed. A third of our railway network had been closed, and our cities were being brutally reshaped around the private motor car, all in the name of progress. Fewer people were using public transport because there was less public transport to use. It was a vicious circle of decline, and it was my job to sort it out. Please welcome to the floor, Greater Manchester's bosses! In the 1960s, our city's buses were run by the region's 11 municipal bus companies, owned by each of our local authorities, or corporations as they were known back then. They were Manchester, Salford, Bolton, Oldham, Stockport, Rochdale, Bury, Stalybridge, Hyde, Mossley and Duckenfield, or SHMD, alongside Lee, Ashton-under-Lyne and Ramsbottom, who sadly could not be here today. Each of the bus companies had their own patches, their own routes, their own timetables and fares. It was a system that had worked well when most people lived and worked in the same local area. But after the Second World War, all over Britain, there had been a policy of deliberate urban sprawl. Large amounts of inner city housing was demolished, and many people were moved to new housing estates far out of the city centres. Our population was now spread across the whole region, and people were left travelling longer and longer distances every day for work. Greater Manchester had become a conurbation, and we needed a new public transport system to match. My dream was to create public transport networks so comprehensive, so efficient and so reliable that everybody could use it without having to rely on the use of a car. Integration, that's what we needed. Buses and trains working together in harmony, providing seamless journeys to every corner of our region. We needed regional transport authorities with wide-reaching powers, in fact, to control every aspect of the transport network to ensure it could all be perfectly coordinated. What next? My 1968 Transport Act created these authorities for our 5 biggest metropolitan areas: Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, Newcastle, and of course, Glasgow. Manchester's Passenger Transport Authority covered more than 500 square miles and served more than 2.6 million people. It went by the catchy name of South East Lancashire, North East Cheshire, or Selneck for short. Selneck came into being on the 1st of November 1969. The 2,500 buses that had belonged to the 11 municipal bus companies came together to form Selneck's fleet. The first step was to standardise everything across the region by painting it all orange. Selneck's mission was to expand and improve the network, to coordinate and integrate routes, timetables and fares. They worked with British Rail to start improving the local rail network. And then they began reshaping the bus network to feed into and complement the railways, giving buses priority over private motor cars on all major roads. Selneck made long-term plans to build a new tram network for the region, and even an underground rail line between Piccadilly and Victoria stations. In just 5 years, Selneck had revolutionised the way we thought about public transport, but it was a brand name that wasn't going to When I was Transport Secretary, I came to realise the secret of success. That is, delivering important regional services like public transport would be made so much easier with a regional government to oversee them. In the new era of conurbation, we needed local government reform. Greater Manchester now needed a regional authority. And so on the 1st of April 1974, the Greater Manchester Council was born. The council took over the powers of the Passenger Transport Authority, and its transport operations were in for another rebrand. Selneck became Greater Manchester Transport, and the emblem was born. Nice emblem. Greater Manchester Transport covered an even bigger area, including Wigan this time. So its old corporation buses were added to the fleet. And then Greater Manchester Transport picked up where Selneck had left off. Its mission was to expand and improve, to coordinate and integrate. They had all the necessary powers and adequate public funding to make it a gleaming success. They bought up nearly all the remaining private bus operations in the region. Clever. They opened new bus stations and garages all over to house their ever-expanding fleet. And they built special bus and rail interchanges to make swapping between modes of transport that much easier. They even experimented with pollution-free electric buses, which was pretty ahead of their time. In just one decade, they had achieved so much. But in 1979, the political shifted, Conservatives took power. More change was on its way.
The Conservatives saw people who travelled by bus as failures in life. They were opposed to the public ownership and control of all services and infrastructure. They saw no benefits in coordination and integration, and they saw great dangers in public subsidy. Their aim was to centralise power in Westminster so they could force through their plans for privatisation. So they abolished the Greater Manchester Council in 1986. Their vision for public transport wouldn't require any strategic planning anyway. They thought the invisible hand of the market could do that work. Their 1985 Transport Act would deregulate bus operations everywhere in Britain except London. The assets of all Britain's publicly owned bus operators had to be transferred into arm's-length public companies. Greater Manchester Transport became GM Buses Limited. Its public subsidy was removed. It put its fares up by 12%. It closed 3 depots and it made 2,000 people redundant.
The 26th of October 1986 was known as D-Day. It was when deregulation came into effect. Suddenly anyone who wanted to could start a bus company and operate wherever they wanted. People bought up old buses wherever they could find them, and the vehicle quality deteriorated overnight. Parts of the city that had had buses since 1929 no longer had a service. The result was chaos, as you can see, and there was a 10% drop in passengers within the first year. Whew! Makes me warm. GM Buses had to compete with all of these newcomers like City Bus and the Beeline Bus Company. There he goes. As well as some old coach businesses like Finglands and Mains, who had been given a new lease of life, woo, since deregulation. Manchester had become one of the most hotly contested areas for urban bus operation. By 1988, GM Buses had lost 30% of its routes, but also many of its competitors had gone bust. In 1989, poor little Beeline Bus Company was bought by a little company you may have heard of from Scotland called Stagecoach. By the end of the 1980s, there were now 63 companies in Greater Manchester, all jostling for passengers on the most profitable routes. Integration had become disintegration. A coordinated, comprehensive network had been sacrificed for the mantra of competition. But the 90s. The Greater Manchester Passenger Transport Executive were now impotent to bystanders. They'd completely lost control of the bus network and so focused on the local rail network instead. They worked with British Rail to launch the Network North West Railway to attempt to improve passenger services across our region. And they finally got approval to build Metrolink. Oh yeah. The first tram line opened in July 1992 and began carrying millions of passengers a year who would have otherwise travelled by car. Metrolink maintained the old ethos of expand and improve to reach more corners of the region, slowly rebuilding the tram network that had been ripped up and destroyed 50 years before. But in the 1990s, our bus services were about to go from bad to worse. There were now 68 operators in the Greater Manchester area, all with their own routes, their own timetables and their own fares, which the travelling public had to try and make sense of. GM bosses had to cut back even more in order to survive, closing 4 more depots and sacking yet more staff. Yet the Conservatives couldn't bear that GM Buses was still a publicly owned company. They thought it was inhibiting real competition. They'd given themselves new powers in the 1985 Transport Act, which meant they could intervene to break GM Buses into 2 smaller companies to get them ready for privatisation. So, in December 1993, GM Buses Limited was split to become GM Buses North and GM Buses South. Handy. Both companies were then sold to their employees in March 1994. The Conservatives claimed that this would bring better services to Manchester and reduce fares, but the opposite proved true. In 1996, GM South was bought by the now not-so-little company Stagecoach. And GM North was bought out by another little Scottish company from Aberdeen called First. These companies now had such a big foothold in the region that they could slowly start picking off all the competition. Citybus was bought out by First. Mains eventually became Stagecoach. And Finglands eventually was bought out by First. You can see what's happening here. Now in private ownership and without any proper competition, bus fares steadily rose and another vicious circle emerged. Fewer people were using the bus because they were so confusing, so expensive and unreliable, so the routes were cut and the prices of the remaining ones went up, which in turn meant fewer people could use the bus. At a time when we should have been starting to reduce carbon emissions and tackle air pollution by improving public transport, more and more people were forced to buy cars. Was fun. Ooh, millennium! By the start of the new millennium, it was clear that the big bug businesses ruled the show. Stagecoach has launched its Magic Bus budget run to undercut the other operators, and any remaining competitors had to play really dirty to survive. One of them was UK North. UK North operated the oldest buses and had terrible pay and staff conditions just to try to keep pace with Stagecoach. They even stole the GM Buses brand name to try to cash in on people's memories and make themselves look like a more legitimate operation. And so, the bus wars began, with UK North running 30 buses an hour to take on Stagecoach's Magic Bus. They ended up gridlocking the city with traffic. They caused several nasty crashes, and one man was sadly killed. A later inquiry found that the driver involved in the crash had worked 19 days without a rest, and that 16 of their bus fleet were completely unroadworthy. UK North were clearly out of control. The traffic commissioner eventually intervened and shot them right down. That was the final straw. 22 years of deregulation had clearly been a race to the bottom. Politicians had finally begun to realise that this free market experiment had failed and more reform was on its way. The 2008 Local Transport Act created integrated transport authorities for our biggest metropolitan areas and gave a few new powers to try to regulate their buses. But these powers were still far too weak, and only one place, Newcastle, was brave enough to use those powers. But the bus companies got together and threatened to sue them for the loss of future profits, and the project was not permitted to go ahead. Saw that one coming. Private companies clearly still had the upper hand, and we were slowly having to relearn everything that I'd bothered to work out back in the 1960s. Successful regional public transport networks go hand in hand with proper regional governance. Greater Manchester needed its regional authority back, and so began a slow process of devolution. In 2011, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority was established. Our passenger transport executive was given more new powers over traffic management and was rebranded again. Transport for Greater Manchester, with a new logo based on the emblem from 1974. It was also announced that Greater Manchester would also have its own mayor, who would be elected in 2017. But while we waited patiently for regulation, bus fares continued to rise and millions more miles of routes were cut. Bus passenger numbers had halved since deregulation in 1986. Then finally, in 2017, it looked like a positive change was finally on its way. Transport for Greater Manchester released their 20-year strategy with integration as its core principle, promising to deliver seamless journeys to the travelling public. And the new Bus Services Act offered new mayors, like Andy Burnham, the same powers as London to regulate their buses. Excellent. But what will he do? Oh yeah, this bit. Woo! Yeah! Let's go! Then this summer, Transport for Greater Manchester unveiled their plans to re-regulate all our region's buses as part of the Our Network scheme, going back to Cellnex's vision from the 1970s. Our network plans to reshape the bus network so that it can again feed into and complement the railway and tram lines so that the system works together as a whole. Sounds obvious. Yeah, you just make it seamless. Great, it's fine. We want it to be seamless, every corner of the region. Re-regulating the buses as part of our network will mean that we can have one simple ticket to hop from bus to train to tram and only have to pay one daily price cap. Look at them go! This is something London has had since 2003 with its Oyster card. Deregulating has left the rest of Britain decades behind, and now it's time to catch up. Woo! Please join me in thanking the fabulous skaters who have been here to take us on this magical journey. They've been great. Yay! We've got Phoebe, Laurel, Kat, Tori, Kirsty, Steve, Charlie, Alice, And I've been Barbara, or Babs. Thank you.